Okay, so what we're going to look at today is the improvement capabilities of the Triaster solution. And what I shall do here is start off by loading the Triaster website. The reason I'm doing this is because you can actually follow this through, during or after the webinar yourself if you wish, because many of these tools are online. So I come into the Triaster platform and then example process libraries. From there, I'm going to browse into the Alpha Choco library. This was a library that we put together last year in celebration of World Quality Day, and we were set the challenge of constructing a process improvement exercise in the context of the supply industry for chocolate. So what you have here is a classic set of Triaster process maps. If I were to come and look at some of these, I can drill down into them. And one of the assumptions I'm making at the moment is that you guys are familiar with Triaster process maps because you're on this webinar, which is more advanced. But I'll just very quickly talk you through the structure of this. An end-to-end process begins with a trigger point and it moves left to right across the page. At each step of the way, we can see there are activities, which are these white boxes, and each activity produces an outcome, which is the shaded boxes. When we get to the end of the page, we can then cross over onto the next process. The assumption is that if a process has an output, then there must be some other process that consumes that output. Otherwise, why are you producing it? And we end up, as we walk through this process, we end up at the other end. So we've gone from one end to the other, and that's what we mean by the term end-to-end process. As we go along, each of these objects here is in fact a database. So if I were to control-click that object, you can see on the left-hand side there's a quite rich data palette underneath these objects, containing lots and lots of data. That's what we're going to be looking at today, is how you can organize this data, how we can simulate the end-to-end process using it to derive total costs, and just how powerful and flexible that data set is. So what I'm going to do now then is, if I go back to the home page, I'm going to imagine exactly as it would be in a real environment. So this live environment is where we've published the process and everybody is able to interact with it and consume it. What I'm now going to do is step into a business analysis environment and look at the as-is process instead. Right, in terms of today, this is actually going to be a clone of the process we've just looked at, but I'm in a ring-fenced area that only my business analysts would have authority to use. And what I'm going to do is drop down into the Triaster software and start to build a picture of these end-to-end processes. So first thing I'd like to know, before we start deriving end-to-end costs and that type of thing, is what does this look like in total? So I'm just going to load up one of these diagrams and just so you can see the correspondence between the two. This loads inside a Visio environment. And all of the data that we've just been looking at, for example, if I were to click this object, I can see in its shape properties. This is where I would now edit this process and change the data. So here are my properties. So this is a direct correlation with the properties we were just looking at on the website, but they're organized now in a specific sequence. So most clients like to work with some RACI information. Often there's some performance management in terms of audit processes and that type of thing that people are doing. There's the suggestion box scheme that you can do through this idea. And for us today, what's particularly important is the time and resources component of the tool. So we'll just focus on this a bit. When you work with Triaster, each of these metrics on the left-hand side, total effort, time units, etc., they're all customizable. They can all be changed to suit your needs. But the ones out of the box look like this. We imagine that every activity has a total effort, and that would be measured in units of some form. And here we're using hours. Wait time would be how often during the process a person is sitting around doing nothing. So in this case, it's 0. And queue time would be any time we have to wait before the process starts. And you can see each of these metrics here we can build up. If we want additional time measurements in there, we can put them in. If we don't want it as complex as this, we can take them out. Resources are in here. The resources gives us the total number of people working on the job. So if the job is 0.25 and there is one resource, then we assume the calendar time of doing this is 0.25. But if there were two resources, it would halve this in terms of calendar time. We tend to recommend, rather than store salary costs and that type of thing directly in here, you work with pay bands. So you might have some coding scheme on a pay band, and that would attach different cost levels to this activity. And we can look at those from a HR system or whatever it may be. Looking a bit further down, and this is an example where actually we've customized this for a specific client that was trying to make a paper process digital. So they were very interested in how much they were going to save on postage costs, ink costs, etc. So you can go right down to this level of granularity where you're literally storing the, the cost per piece of paper. If you're a university and you still write to, your 10,000 students at the end of each year, that is a significant cost if you can replace it with an email. So in our tool, you can store those costs, and then we can use those when we're comparing the as-is with the to-be. Move a little bit further on down the list here. Risk analysis, that's very common. This is a simple 5 by 5, so if the risk frequency is high and the risk severity is high, then I end up with 25. If it's 0, then clearly there is no risk. We can also record against each object its value-added status. This is very important for some of the reasons we'll see a little bit later on. Value-added, non-value-added, necessary, non-value-added. They're the typical 3 elements of a process in terms of value stream analysis, and they can be attached to those activities. And I won't go through every field, but there's non-conformances in here and various other things. Now, important thing is when we get to the bottom, you can see that there's a section called Triaster calculated metrics. So we don't recommend that you put costs in if you're able to put in effort and resources instead and cost per unit of time. We can calculate the various costs based on the other fields at the top. So this particular object, we're seeing it has a total cost of labour and consumables of 15 units. In this, again, units might be pounds, dollars, euros, whatever you want to store in the system. So we've got a combination of entered values and calculated values, and these apply to every object in the system. So if I come and look at another decision over here, you can see equally there are placeholders for me to store any of these attributes if I wish. This particular one isn't incurring much in the way of cost or time. And then on the deliverables, equally there'll be a data palette appropriate to them. So the challenge for us as a business analyst is not really, this bit is easy to work out how long an activity takes, who does it, etc., is really quite straightforward. Where the whole thing becomes a bit more difficult is if we've got the problem of trying to understand, and let me just go down into the process on the website, from beginning to end what the total cost is. So if I were to start the process here, you can see instantly there's a decision on the first thing is 10% of the time we stop the process because we're rejecting the supplier. 90% of the time we actually carry on. Now, if I'm trying to work out costs of a process from beginning to end, I have to take into account each and every pathway through that process together with its likelihood when I'm working out the total end-to-end cost. Once you add in back loops and several decision points in sequence, mathematically that becomes very difficult to do. So the only way we can do that is actually simulate the process, which is we walk through it from beginning to end in the computer and thousands of times, and by doing so we build up an end-to-end cost. And that's what we're going to be looking at today. Okay, so what I'm now going to do is, before I start the simulation off, I'd just like to get an understanding of this end-to-end process a bit more clearly. So I'm going to come in here and use some of the inbuilt tools. So we're now looking at the Triaster software. And the first thing I'd like to do is just get a single page picture, if you like, of the entire end-to-end process. So I'm generating an end-to-end diagram, which is a single plotter print of the whole process from beginning to end that you could use as a wall, a wall view as such. So let's get that loaded up there. So it's going through the process and it's starting to build up the picture of how these 4 process maps link with each other. I'll just give that a second to complete. There we go. So what I've got here on this page, and it's probably a little bit easier if I just drag that to there. Obviously, you'd expect to do a little bit of manipulation from time to time on some of these diagrams. So what I've got the process that starts over here, and you can see that's exactly the same as the process we were just looking at. It has two outputs, and I can now follow the green arrows to see where those outputs go. And clearly, in a a work environment, I could, like I say, print this out on the wall, and this is fantastic. We see customers using this to walk staff through the process from beginning to end. That production schedule itself comes back out. We follow the blue arrow because that's going slightly backwards up there. So I'm happy with that. That's a well-connected process. I don't have any hanging islands. They would appear here if I did, or process chains. So I'm happy that I've got a well-formed diagram there. Another quick view of that I can take is a hierarchy diagram. So I'll just generate one of those for you also. You can see we're doing this all in live time. We find it's much more useful this way. So I'm going to generate a process hierarchy. And what this does, it's like a process tree on a page. It lets me see in one piece of paper the structure of the process that I've drawn. So I can check that the various drill downs and so on that I've got here are what I expect. And again, this is exactly what I expect. I have the 4 top-level processes with each of their children. If I had further drill downs, they would appear beneath in the tree. And that's a good example, actually, of what's also called a work breakdown structure. So if I wanted to, I can export this whole thing into a Gantt chart format or a project plan. So let's pop it into Microsoft Project. So I'll pop it over this file here. Click OK, and then load up Microsoft Project. So all I'm doing here is I'm satisfying myself that I've got a process that's well formed, well structured, and properly connected by using or viewing it in various different tools. There we see exactly the same process there again. And if I'd had drill downs, they would appear here as subtasks. Just out of interest, you can see that the duration field is being populated. That's based on the right-click properties that we looked at a moment ago. We're carrying through the total effort as a calendar time in this case. Okay, so there we go. So I'm happy now that I've got a process here that will lend itself to simulation. And what I'm now going to do, therefore, is generate the simulation report. So what we have is what's called a process status report. When I run this, it's literally walking through the process from beginning to end. And each time it encounters an object, you can see each of the runs here that are totting up. We're going to do 1,000 today, but you could do millions, in fact. But each time it encounters an object on each one of those runs, it adds a cost to the average. It adds effort and value add to the average as appropriate, and writes the whole thing into a summary document that we'll look at in a moment. So I can get a feel for the, if you like, the metrics of the entire end-to-end process. Now, obviously, in a webinar like this, we only use 1,000 runs. It could well be 100,000 or, like I say, millions, depending on the complexity of the process. While that's been running, it's actually been uploading as well. So if I now come back into my environment, you can see on my business analysis menu, I've got the process status report. Now, we know from experience, the first time we click this after an upload, we get a 500 exception. So I'm just going to refresh that. Click open. And you'll see we're doing this in real time. So that was generated at 14:14, so just a few seconds ago. And let's have a look at this report now. So this report is telling me the process status report for the trigger point, the new supplier sourced, and it breaks down the report into these sections for me. So the initial section around cost, time, effort, and so on. Then we get a breakdown of costs. It has a look at risks and various other things. And this is the summary report. This is what we found most people are most interested in seeing. So let's start with the cost, time, and effort. So that cost there, that has been calculated because after 1,000 simulation runs from beginning to end, it's worked out on average how much it costs every time that trigger point happens. And the more runs we do, the more accurate that will get. It's worked out that there are 151 hours of effort involved, this amount of wait time. Therefore, the total cycle time, which is the clock time, if you like, from beginning to end, is 431 hours. This is an area that's very, there's so much jargon and terminology and different meanings given to various words here. We've tried to adopt the Six Sigma approach to naming these things. Some of the activities in that process are value adding, others weren't. So here we can see that 49 hours of all of this effort is deemed to be value adding. And that gives us a process cycle efficiency score here of 11%, 11.36%. The process cycle efficiency is a Six Sigma metric which tells you the proportion of value add time in the process. So by and large, if that goes up when you're looking at a process compared to a previous one, then you've probably done something good. If it drops down, then all you may have done, you may have improved in some respects, but what you've actually done is reduce the proportion of value add in the process, which is not always a good thing. The very next question most people ask is, how does that cost come about? So if we now look at the cost detail breakdown, we can see that carry out supplier vetting is contributing £83 to the cost. That's because every time we run the process, this happens, and every time we run it, it costs £83. You'll recall there was a branch point with 10% and 90%. So we're already seeing now that these activities only happen 90% of the time, and this 0.91 as opposed to 0.9 is simply, because we're doing a simulation, there is a random element, and the more runs you do, the more accurate that will get. But over the 1,000 runs we did, 910 went on one branch as opposed to 900. Okay, so if I were to click on this, for example, let's click on carry out supplier vetting. So this is the process we were just looking at. If I click there, this is the SVG view, by the way, that we use, which is Chrome compatible and mobile phone compatible and that type of thing. So this is an element of the product too. So if I just scroll down the properties, where do we get to? Just trying to find that 83. No, I tell you what, I've not published. I haven't published these maps yet. Although we've got the process status report, I've not refreshed the publish. So we'll come back to that in a second. So back to that report again. So each object that appears in the process has a corresponding total cost every time it's run, and then a cost contribution based on the likelihood of it being run. So in the final case here, where we've got 1% branch points, even though it costs £240, it's only contributing £2.88 to the process. Okay, and then there's various other elements to this report that help me understand what the status of that process is in terms of cost, time, and effort. Okay, that's all well and good. What most business analysts are interested in, however, is not necessarily the cost, time, and effort of the existing process, but how it compares with all the other processes that we want to model. So you'll see that I'm in the as-is site. There are also two other sites. We have a 2B1 and a 2B2. Now these are, for the purposes of today, they're variants of the existing process. So the as-is is how we do it currently. The 2B1 and the 2B2 are possible variants that we're dealing with to understand, to try and model a better process. If I were to click into these, you'll see that they're very similar in outline structure, and they have the same underlying processes, but I've marked in yellow the objects that are being altered. So that helps me understand what it is I'm proposing to change. So for the purposes of today, what you can assume is that the 2B1 and the 2B2 are different in some way, and we as business analysts now need to ask the question, well, is which one are we going to adopt? Which is the better one? Okay, so as part of the solution, What we also offer you is called the process comparison report, and you can see that here. The process comparison report is just that. It's telling me, and I ran this just before the session started, it's telling me how one processor compares with the others. And if I go straight down to the tables this time, so there's my as-is process with its costs, and here are the costs of the two Bs. So the two Bs both look very similar, but they both look better, at least in cost terms, than the as-is. They both seem to have a lower cycle time, which is good, and significant reductions in total effort. And this is because part of the process has been automated in this example. Specifically on the Lean Six Sigma side of things, we can see the cycle time has gone down. But if you notice, the process cycle efficiency has also dropped. So there is an argument possibly here that even though we seem to be doing it faster and at lower cost, we may have just stripped out all the value-adding elements of the process as far as the customer is concerned. And you know, this is why these things are never straightforward. There's always a balance between potential improvements and actual improvements. So this report should be taken as part of the evidence rather than the answer. And then the final bit of the puzzle here is, okay, we have the process costs, which we're annualizing based on an estimate of how often it happens, and that therefore gives me the ability to compare total annual costs of these processes. Looks like we're saving 6K if we make a move. Do we still want to do it? So that's an example of just one process, and the same rules would apply on every single end-to-end process. When you're a business analyst, of course, these things often, it's not just the summary reports you want. You're always interested in the detail. So you'll also see a metrics model. And if I open that, this is a compiled Excel environment of the process, and my key metrics I'm going to pop through here, and if I drill down into the detail, okay, so what we're looking at here is for the end-to-end process in one of the two Bs, it's broken out for us every single pathway through that process. In other words, every unique sequence of activities and deliverables from beginning to end that we could possibly encounter. During the simulation, it identified 30 of them. And you'll see over here the percentage. If I were to just mark that as a percentage and quickly do a tot up, that should come to 100% because there we go. So it's identified every path. Some of them are so unlikely that it doesn't, you know, it's fractions, 0.2%, and right down at the bottom, yeah, 0.2%. So they happen very, very infrequently, these pathways. And then the one that's most likely is pathway 1 at the top, which happens 49% of the time. Now, for each pathway, we can see the breakdown of every single metric that appears in the process maps. Typically, the cost is, again, where everybody is really keen to look. So you can see that this pathway 1, which happens nearly half the time, costs £83 every time it happens. All the other pathways look like they're exception pathways of some form because the cost ramps up. But fortunately, we don't do them very often. So the point about this analysis is, if I was trying to save cost, I'm clearly not going to bother with pathway 30 because it hardly ever happens. I'm going to get the bulk of my cost savings by looking at paths 1, 2, and 3. And clearly paths 2 and 3 are the ones that I would want to look at the most. All right, so given that I'm told that, I can now go and have a look at every single pathway through the process. So you can see pathway 1, which does happen a lot of the time. We're rejecting a lot more suppliers on this 2B process. Pathway 2 is where we accept them, and you can see every single object that we go through, every step there is all broken out together with how much it costs every time it happens, all there for you. Pathway 3, again, quite a long process, but I can work out from this exactly what sequence of events is happening that would lead to this path. So every single one of these paths is highlighted in the or broken out for me in the Excel file. And if I go right to the end of that Excel file, I'm also given the difference matrix. The difference matrix. This is what object the pathways branch. So pathway 3 branches from pathway 2 at the 35th object. And that's useful if I'm trying to understand or pinpoint where the processes diverge. So we're able to get very quickly into an understanding of what our most costly pathways are, precisely where they branch from the least cost pathways, and that gives us a handle on what we need to do. Then the final element of this is every object across all of the processes is broken out for us in a database at the back, and this is what's driving the Excel environment. So if I don't want to go back into Visio and change the properties, actually if I change them here in this file, it will filter through to my top level analysis. Okay, so what we've gone through there is a very quick overview of the key reports that Triaster outputs by default. We've had a look at the ability to create process metrics, i.e. not just the ones out of the box, but any metrics that you'd like to work with, and the ease with which you can simulate that whole thing. I'm just going to finish off finally with something that's quite recent for us in 16.4, but we've been looking at Triaster-based process maps. If I wanted to instead, I can now use any Visio diagram I wish. So if I just come into Visio itself, and let's say I wanted to work on BPMN, for example, I can load a BPMN diagram. And now with 16.4 of Triaster, if I can come onto the Triaster menu and enable that document as a Triaster document, so Triaster can now understand the components of that diagram. And when I drag and drop a task object, for example, this is a BPMN task, I do have the same ability to define metrics as I do with any other Triaster diagram. And I have the same ability to produce process status reports and so on. So on this particular object, I might say that it's 50 minutes of effort, for example, and that is now a component of that task. So we find most customers love the standard Triaster template. So because of its ease of use and because it's very clear and easy for end users to understand, so that the standard out-of-the-box process maps we've just been looking at. But actually, if you choose to use a different diagramming standard, that's entirely your choice. Okay, so this is the standard task.